Hello everyone, it's T-Lore with STOBETTER. For the longest time, Fire at Will was set to have a longer cooldown than other firing modes. As of October 1st, 2025, Fire at Will and Subsystem Targeting have the same cooldown scheme as every other firing mode. What does this mean for you? Is this a monumental change or just another patch note? I'm going to go through 5 impacts this has for players in all stages of the game. Number 1. New players. When you are new to the game, you don't have the same breadth of starship traits, duty officers, and gear that veterans of the game have. As such, players may slot a little bit of everything as they are finding their way through the story missions of the game. If you slot only one copy of Fire at Will, you'll notice absolutely no change. However, on some starter builds flush with tactical seating, there's a good reason to slot Fire at Will twice to double your uptime. Instead of 20 out of 40 seconds, now you have 20 out of 30 seconds. With only a single copy of Fire at Will, you get 10 out of 30 seconds. By slotting a second copy, you get 20 out of 30 seconds. Previous to the patch, the best you could hope for was 20 out of 40 seconds with 2 copies of the power. Number 2. Starter Builds. Once you get to our starter tier builds, somewhere around a month after hitting level 50, we start to work with cooldown reduction. Photonic Officer and Aux to Bat with Technicians are cost-effective ways to manage cooldowns, and only one copy of Fire at Will is needed. The October patch took players that were using cooldown mechanics and Fire at Will from a 10 out of 20 seconds to 10 out of 15 seconds. This is strictly 33% more uptime on the firing mode. While this seems huge, it's actually only bringing it in line with every other firing mode in the game. This does mean, however, that builds that were more lenient on their cooldown scheme to only hit the 20 seconds of Fire at Will may want to look at shoring up the extra 5-second gap. Number 3. Economy Fire at Will builds. Once you get out of starter tier and start picking up C-Store ships, we start to talk about firing mode extenders. While Fire at Will happens to have the most firing mode extensions, until recently all of them came with hoops to jump through. Entwined Tactical Matrices is the go-to Fire at Will extension, turning Torpedo Spread into an extra copy of Fire at Will. The drawbacks here are that you have to have a torpedo to benefit from the trait, and the Torpedo Spread enabled Fire at Will is only rank 1. This meant if you're using Fire at Will 3, you had an off cycle where you were only using Fire at Will 1, watering down your damage output. If you are a tank or a support only pushing Fire at Will 1 with Entwined Tactical Matrices, we'll talk about your impacts in a moment. Thanks to some math from Jay, linked in the description, Fire at Will 1 is a 1.943 multiplier on damage, and Fire at Will 3 is a 2.199 multiplier on damage. If you're really diligent on hitting Fire at Will and Torpedo Spread at the right time to keep Fire at Will going, you get an even 50-50 split of both Fire at Will 1 and Fire at Will 3, for an average multiplier of 2.071, roughly the equivalent of using Fire at Will 2 all the time, which is 2.069. A couple of caveats here. If you use Fire at Will, fire off your Torpedo Spread, and then use Torpedo Spread again immediately, you eat into your uptime. Your original Fire at Will not be off cooldown again before Fire at Will runs out. That's why you really have to watch when you activate Fire at Will and Torpedo Spread when you're using Entwined Tactical Matrices. If you use Entwined Tactical Matrices, you also have to make sure you equip a torpedo, which may or may not be of benefit to you. We cover the good and bad of throwing in an extra torpedo in our 1-torp video. Prior to the patch, best practice was to time the Torpedo Spread just as Fire at Will ended. You can still continue this practice and you'll hardly notice the difference. However, you can also hit Torpedo Spread a little earlier and get additional Fire at Will uptime. This could give you as much as a 2% overall damage increase if you hit Torpedo Spread right at 5 seconds into your Fire at Will. This allows the Torpedo Spread's Fire at Will to cover the gap in your cooldown on Fire at Will, and then run out just as your native Fire at Will is available again. If nothing else, you can hit Torpedo Spread a second or two before Fire at Will ends and shore up any gaps in firing mode, which math isn't going to show you. So at best, you get 2% more damage output for modifying your piloting, and at worst, you get a little more leeway in your existing Fire at Will and Torpedo Spread activations. One thing to be aware of is that your torpedoes may not come off cooldown quickly enough to support the Fire at Will activation cycle. You can slot a projectile weapons officer that has a chance to shorten the cooldown of your torpedo if this is an issue, but we're talking about at best 2%. Don't shake up your whole build just for this small upside. Number 4. Projectile Builds. The other side of the entwined tactical matrices is the torpedo spread side, which is utilized on most economy and higher tier projectile builds. This lets you turn cannon scatter volley and fire at will buttons into an additional torpedo spread. This is a solid contribution to overall damage on projectile builds and will continue to be highly recommended. The benefit you get now is that fire at will cycles 5 seconds faster. This also means that your fire at will's torpedo spreads will be up more often. While we are here, a word of caution. You can't stack up 2 entwined tactical matrices torpedo spreads at once. If you hit fire at will and scatter volley in quick succession, you only get 1 torpedo spread. You need to fire 1 torpedo spread off before activating another. This is further complicated by concentrate firepower granting high yield, as well as your own high yield sitting in the queue. Make sure you space them out at first, and hopefully the cooldown cycles will keep them out of sync enough that you can continue to get both torpedo spreads. If anything, cannon scatter volley and fire at will having the same minimum cooldown means it will be easier to keep them from syncing up. If you have the Pavan Crystal Battery, you could equip that for even shorter cycles on the cannon scatter volley torpedo spread, but the entire console slot for the slightly faster torpedo spreads probably doesn't really pay off. Not to mention, it's really hard to get enough cooldown reduction to keep cannon scatter volley at 12 seconds over 15. Number 5. Redirecting Arrays. Redirecting arrays gets the largest buff out of anything in this suite of changes. Redirecting arrays, precision multi-targeting, entwined tactical matrices, Starfleet hopefuls, and Breen Free Fire are all considered firing mode extenders for fire at will. Before the patch, redirecting arrays could only get you to 15 out of 20 seconds, and that's assuming you're taking damage every second. This relegated this trait to suboptimal and only for tanks. Entwined tactical matrices was still strictly better. However, with the minimum cooldown of fire at will being 15 seconds now, redirecting arrays has the most to gain. It gets you to 100% uptime as long as you are taking damage. If we pull this thread a little bit, swapping redirecting arrays for entwined tactical matrices is a solid damage boost to fire at will, especially if you're using rank 2 or 3. If you're using rank 1, there's essentially no difference in beam damage output. Where entwined tactical matrices requires both a torpedo and slotting torpedo spread, redirecting arrays requires taking consistent damage. On the surface, this relegates it to tank builds that are putting themselves out there to take damage. This does allow you to experiment with removing the torpedo. However, as we covered in our 1-torp video, the torpedo also gains you supercharged weapons, which is a solid damage trait. Something else you may want to consider is that flyer apart does damage you every second, so if you're doing an energy build and have the pilot seating to pick up flyer apart, you may want to consider redirecting arrays for a better fire at will uptime. All in all, this is a great change for fire at will. It's certainly a strong firing mode, and making it function like every other firing mode in the game really helps simplify the math soup that is Star Trek Online. The best part is that this is a free change. No expensive promo ships to buy, no missions to run for a month to unlock, simply a new state in the game.
Fire again!
I love getting to see what you guys learn or what I missed. I still learn too. Be sure to check out all of our guides and builds at www.stobetter.com.